Hello and welcome to Live from America podcast. This is Hatem. Noam is away. We both were away last couple of weeks, so we didn't have any episode, but we are back. Noam's still away. He's coming back next week. But I'm here with a very special guest, a very good friend, and he's the kind of guest, like I always say, he's the friend that you want to have, because you can talk to, and he doesn't take sides. He talks about the law, professional, and he's funny, the one and only Michel Paradis. He
Thank
is,
you much. And I'm a lawyer, so I can get you out of prison. I think that's the other reason
well,
you
I mean,
have
for
me as
sure.
a
That's why
friend.
we're friends. You're amazing.
That's
He's the
right.
leading human rights lawyer, an expert in international law, a historian, national security law scholar, everything that you need, all the big words, he's there. And he is a great author. He have two books, I mean, more than two books, I guess, but two books that we covered.
Two books worth reading, probably. Yeah.
Yeah, there are two books that we covered in here. So I encourage you to listen to these episodes. One most recently is The Light of the Battle, and Last Mission to Tokyo. And I believe that one day both of them going to be great movies. Played by Dwayne Johnson, I think we said the last time, right?
Yeah, I think that was my Brandon Fraser actually got cast in a movie they're doing about Eisenhower that I read about like a month or two ago.
Oh,
Different
okay.
direction than The Rock. I'm not going to lie, but I still stand by my
And I
casting
think
choice.
the more when I read the book and the more I know about Eisenhower, like you said, like a football player, all this, I think The Rock will be a good choice.
Yeah, I think it'd be a great choice. He's got the smile too. You need like a football player with a great smile. That's a
So we're going to cover a lot of very important topics. And I think you're one of the people I always like to talk about because you're friends with me and Noam. You don't take sides, you say it as it is. And I think a lot of people, when you hear coverage or questions, there's always an agenda that connected to it. I feel people want to find the expert that's going to support their point of view, and they will find it because there's a lot right there that will say like, hey, this is what it is. But I think you've always been fair and you know the law very well. And I think it's good to listen to your opinions. And that's why I always wanted to when there's a question that I want to ask about, especially international law, war crimes, all that, I want to talk to you.
thank you. I hope my daughters, who are only 6 years old, listen to what you just said and realize that they should listen to me as well. They don't at the moment, but
One
I hope
day, one
one
day.
day. Yeah.
So we're approaching about a year of the war. So we're going to talk about that in a minute. But most recently, there was this, exploding pagers and radios, walkie-talkies that happened. That Israel, I guess, Secret Service or Mossad planned against Hezbollah operative. Resulted and then more than 30 people died and hundreds that were injured. So I read a lot of, there was different opinions, different stuff. But there is this report that I sent you from the UN that says that exploding pagers and radios are terrifying violation of international law. That one UN expert says. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't. And I read the statement. So what you're talking about is a number of what are called UN special rapporteurs. And so these are individuals who are given for lack of a better word, like an office, a temporary job to investigate something. And so the kind of people on the list are all really well respected. And a lot of people actually I respect, to be perfectly frank with you. But so, for example, it's like the special rapporteur on the protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism, which is Ben Saul, or the special rapporteur on extrajudicial summary executions, the special rapporteur on the right to education, right? It's essentially a joint letter by what is probably best thought of as like a various experts that the UN has hired to investigate various aspects around the world. So this is not an official statement quote from the UN,
Oh
right?
yeah, yeah.
The UN very rarely issues anything that would resemble an official statement.
Yeah, there's some people like you see, like there's a lot of a politician also said that hey, the booby traps is according to the 1980 law is that everybody signed, including Israel and Lebanon, is forbidden. So yeah, different people, not necessarily the UN, but yeah, some
Yeah,
experts.
yeah. So all I meant to say that by that is that these are largely international human rights lawyers. Many of them are very well respected. I respect many of them as well. And they issued essentially the equivalent of a press release or a joint statement commenting on the use of the pagers as a weapon. And as your listeners probably know, Israel is widely believed. I don't know if we've gotten official confirmation, but Israel's basically was able to intercept a shipment of beepers that Hezbollah had distributed amongst its operatives in order to evade Israeli electronic surveillance on cell phones. And by intercepting those beepers, they were able to essentially booby trap them with small explosives that simultaneously went off a few weeks ago, or a week and a half ago, I guess now. As you said, killing a number of people, including some children, and grievously wounding thousands who had these pagers either on their person or were holding them, etc. And so how does that break down? How does the pager attack break down as a matter of international law? And the honest answer is it's actually a really hard question. And if you read the nuances of the press release, beyond the headline, I think much of it is correct in its analysis. But I do worry about the politicization of sort of grand statements about war criminality, particularly in the Israeli, Gaza and Lebanon Hezbollah conflict, because they tend to be reduced down to a tweet, and I don't know that that's helpful to anybody. In part because I think I'm a lawyer, I'm pedantic, and I like specificity, and I like being accurate, and all that kind of good stuff. But I also worry that there is a very strong strain within the Israeli government, to include the prime minister, who is quite hostile, frankly, to international law, to international institutions, right? There's something fundamentally, there is a very illiberal faction within the Netanyahu coalition, to include, I would say, the prime minister himself, that looks for these opportunities to tell the Israeli population that Israel is under assault from all sides, and no matter what we do to respect the law of war, international humanitarian law, or human rights, the UN is going to criticize us unfairly all the time, right? It contributes to a sense of siege that I think is very easy to politically exploit by the really genuinely illiberal parts of the Israeli government, and I worry about I worry about that, because I think that's very counterproductive in some ways, because we want the Israeli government. The reason, I'll say it this way, the reason Israel gets criticized, and Israelis are often complaining about this, and they're not entirely without reason in saying, is that why are you criticizing us for our particular acts of breaches of international law or violations of international humanitarian law or war crimes, when look at what Hamas is doing, look at what Hezbollah is doing, right? These are indiscriminate attacks directed oftentimes at civilians, Israeli civilians, and you don't hear the same sort of swells of complaint from international organizations or foreign ministries, etc. And the answer often given to Israel is, well, yeah, but those are terrorist organizations, and Israel is a first world country. It's part of the community of nations, and therefore is being, the downside to being a part of the community of nations is that you're held to the standards of the community of nations. And so, yes, there's in a sense a double standard, but that's because Israel is not Hamas. Israel is not Hezbollah. Israel's not even Iran in this context. And to some extent, that is always been a problem in Israel's diplomatic relations, because they, are fighting against enemies that, are not held to the same standards that they are, and that is very easy to translate in Israeli domestic politics to a sense of grievance and siege that I think at its worst encourages the most illiberal parts of the Israeli government to just say, fuck it, right? Like, no one's ever going to like us anyway, so we may as well behave.
But there's also the big
Yeah.
third part, which is the Palestinian civilians, which is much more than Hamas. And it tends to always be, okay, we're going to talk about that it's Israel. Like, I think they try to do that a lot, Israel versus Hamas, while there is people in the middle. You can argue, yeah, absolutely. Hamas is putting in the middle, or Israel is put in the middle, but it seems like, we're fighting Hamas at all costs. If those were American citizens or European citizens, it wouldn't have been the same, So, but I just wanted to add this.
Yeah, no. And again, please don't misunderstand this as being an apologist for the Israelis, for the Israelis' worst excesses in Gaza. That's not my intent. I'm just trying to sort
Yeah.
of, I was trying to sort of just like set the table in terms
Yeah.
of
No,
how
and that's
states.
what I said in the beginning of this
Yeah,
conversation is like we want to know, when we want to talk about something, if the
yeah,
international law says something, we want to understand it without agendas, without politics, because if it says something, if that's a crime, then we want to know.
yeah.
If it's not a crime, then it changed. So that's why. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, so getting then like to the specifics, what are the actual concerns? There are some legitimate concerns with the pager attack. So at the biggest concern that I would have as an international lawyer looking at these questions, that any military analyst would have looking at these questions is how confident were the Israelis that these beepers, the sabotage beepers that they distributed to Hamas, were actually in the hands of essentially military operatives
Hezbollah, I mean.
within within Hezbollah, right? Within, so because Hezbollah is a big organization. It is a terrorist organization. I'm not defending Hezbollah before I start getting tweets about that. I'm not defending Hezbollah, but it is to say that Hezbollah is a very large organization. It has a political wing, much like Sinn Féin and the IRA historically have had in Ireland. Hezbollah does a lot of different things to include quasi-governing parts of Lebanon, has various civil affairs aspects, right? So not every person within Hezbollah is a legitimate target under the law of war. Simply being a member of Hezbollah does not automatically give Israel the right to kill you. And so a question, and it is a question, and I have to emphasize that enough because I think that gets lost in some of the critiques of what Israel did. But a question is, how confident were the Israelis? What information did the Israelis have to indicate that these beepers were being distributed principally, primarily, significantly, whatever the standard would be, to the combatant parts of Hezbollah? I think there's reason to believe they were, because the need for hyper secure communications is obviously going to be much more of a military requirement than it's going to be something that you're going to need to have with like the hospitals you're running or the soccer teams they're sponsoring it, things like that. Those are going to be the kinds of communications that Hezbollah is most likely going to be wanting to protect from Israel, right?
Yeah.
So the idea that these beepers are being distributed to
Well, again, we're not trying to defend Hezbollah, but it could possibly be somebody who is a civilian doctor that needs to be on call to go to certain people. Like there's a lot of things
exactly,
that could be.
exactly, but it also could be them. That's
Yeah, it could be somebody
exactly what.
forced to have it.
Exactly. And that is a real cause for concern. And the honest answer is we don't know. There is no reliable reporting on this. I don't know that there's any investigation or like credible investigation that's been released on this about who exactly were given these pagers and what did Israel know about who had been given these pagers. Because, and again, this is not, I'll present it both ways. If Israel had no idea who these pagers were being given to, and given the size and complexity and diversity of individuals, who might get a pager from Hezbollah, and it was just, hey, they're the Hezbollah brand pager, we're going to distribute them, and we have no idea where they're going to go, that might be a war crime because that could be an indiscriminate attack. You have to know that you're only targeting individuals who it's legal to target, right? Combatants, in essence, or in this context, someone who is taking a direct part in hostilities, and that can mean a lot of things. But what we ordinarily think of as a soldier or someone performing a warlike function. On the other hand, Israel might have really good information about who these beepers were going to, why. They might even know the names of the people. Who knows, right? They obviously were conducting surveillance on these devices for months, according to the reporting we have, that they've been distributed for at least, I think, three to 6 months. I'm trying to remember exactly. And that gave potentially Israel a lot of time to determine the location of the beepers, the movement of those beepers, et cetera, how the sort of pattern of life that individuals carrying those beepers might have engaged in. So the honest answer is we don't know, and jumping to conclusions one way or another. One being, no, Israel was just targeting combatant militants, responsibly targeting Hezbollah militants, is just as baseless, right, in terms of lacking evidentiary support, as an argument saying, no, they were indiscriminately distributing them to the people of Lebanon and just killing random civilians. I think both of those statements have zero factual support at the moment. And so that's something that I think we need to think carefully about. And that was one of my one of my problems, just to sort of close that thought out, was the statement that was released by the special rapporteurs was it actually says that, just to be clear. It doesn't say it the way I said it, which is clearly and specifically. It says we would be gravely concerned if, right? Like there's a lot of like this and that and potentially this. And I get that as lawyers, they put those caveats in because they are thinking about it almost certainly exactly the same way as I am. But I think when you put it in a press release, calling this a terrifying, new escalation in inhumanity around the world, or whatever precisely they called it, I don't know that a press release like this is going to carry the qualifications and nuance that its authors clearly understand are involved with a question like that.
What about the booby trap part of it? Because that's another argument that we're talking about, not who the target, but the weapon itself, kind of like chemical weapons, kind of like laser, kind of like this is forbidden by international law. Is that justified or not? I mean, I understand war, we would do anything to target certain people, but now we don't know who they are, if they are. So that's one argument. But what about the booby trap, just the weapon itself?
Yeah. So booby traps are just a specific category of weapon that are exactly what they sound like, right? Booby traps. And they're controversial, but the prohibition on their use is narrower than it might immediately sound. There is no general prohibition on booby traps in international law, either as a matter of conventional or customary international law. Instead, the rule respecting booby traps specifically is that you can't booby trap is two things, really, primarily. One is you can't booby trap things that are themselves in some way protected or seem to be protected. So, for example, you can't, booby trap children's toys. You can't booby trap a church. You can't put booby traps on things that, by their apparent character, would tell the person that they are safe, that there's nothing that they are safe under international law, to be clear, right? That they're safe because international law provides protection to them. You can't booby trap an ambulance. You can't booby trap, Red Cross packages, for example, right? Those kinds of things where you invite the person to think that this is protected as a matter of international law, that is in fact what's booby trapped. That is wrong, right? That's kind of what is sometimes international law is called perfidious or perfidy, right? It's pretending to be protected under international law, and when you're not. Another example would be booby trapping like a civilian, what it looks like a wounded civilian on the ground, so that medics, for example, from a soldier's company might run over to try and help the person, and then obviously be attacked by the booby trap. That sort of thing is not permitted. The second principle governing booby traps is that you can't use booby traps that essentially by their nature are indiscriminate. And that gets to the other question we were talking about before, right? You can't booby trap things where you really have no idea or principled reason to know that the person who's going to encounter this booby trap is going to be a otherwise lawful target, right? A soldier, as opposed to what's called a non-combatant or a civilian. So obvious examples there are, you're allowed to put booby traps all around the battlefield. The Germans were sort of infamous for this during the Second World War, where they would leave
Boys.
really what? Sorry?
Boys.
Like they'd literally leave goodies,
Yeah.
really cool looking Nazi flags and helmets, things that they knew the Americans were picking up as souvenirs, and they would booby trap those in foxholes so that when the Americans went through a foxhole, they'd say, "Oh, look, isn't this cool? It's a German helmet," and then they'd pick the helmet up and it would explode, right? So that's a totally legal use of booby traps. It would be different if, for example, the Germans were booby trapping essentially every doorway in France, right? And just on the assumption that anyone walking through a doorway would essentially open up a door and then potentially be killed or wounded in that context. This issue about discrimination is the principle, right? The idea that you're only actually trying to target soldiers as opposed to civilians is one of the reasons why landmines historically have been extremely controversial, right? Think about what a landmine is. A landmine's a booby trap. And the United States and many other countries, but mostly just now the United States, have historically defended the use of landmines for any number of reasons. So if you think of like the border between North Korea and South Korea, that's a whole big minefield designed to keep both sides at bay. And so the United States says, look, there are a lot of circumstances under which those kinds of booby traps, i.e. landmines, serve a really valuable function. And even arguably, even in that context, like a peaceable function, because it's a way of ensuring that neither the North nor the South of Korea invades across the DMZ. Lots of countries oppose landmines now, and so that's sort of like the direction of the law is increasingly against those kinds of things. But how does a pager fall into everything I just said? Well, a pager is not a inherently civilian object, right? There's no law of war protection for pagers or communications equipment. Again, getting to kind of the things we were talking about a few minutes ago, right? If Israel had a high degree of confidence that these pagers were being distributed to combatants within Hezbollah, like Hezbollah soldiers, then there's nothing protected about that, and that also would show a keen attention to discrimination, right? Making sure only Hezbollah combatants had those pagers. On the other hand, you can imagine situations, for example, like let's say they booby-trapped these pagers 4 years ago, right? 4 years later, do you know who has that pager? And pagers inevitably are going to get sold, gray marketed, into the ordinary market, or sold or given to a buddy, or you name it. And so had that been the case, right, it might be a problem where you have essentially a kind of ordinary object that has this explosive in it that is now just circulating amongst the civilian population. And so detonating it under those circumstances very well would be a war crime. I think I don't have a lot of hesitation in saying would be a war crime if they had essentially very little intelligence or control over where the beepers were going, who had them, particularly because a beeper is not something when you see it, might be dangerous for some reason. Right? Nothing inherently dangerous about picking up a beeper the way picking up a gun might be, or an explosive or something else. So
who is responsible? Like, does Israel have to show evidence that, this is the intelligent way, or they don't have to? Like, according to international law, like if you are accused of something, do you have to sell it, or you say like, hey, this is a war, we have our intelligence that we cannot share, we don't have to do it? And the second question is like, I'm thinking about, because I see a lot of like, from what you're saying, if we say there's a terrorist organization, does the civilians that like somebody's wife or children or whatever, do they count as terrorists as well, or no? Obviously they, if let's say they know everything, they know that this guy is a terrorist, they know he's in Hezbollah, is it a fair game, or is it not under the international? We're talking specifically under the international law.
Yeah. So I'll take those backwards, actually. So on the second one, no, they're not legitimate targets. They're civilians. Just because you are a member of a terrorist organization doesn't automatically put a bullseye on the member of your family.
So then you have to make sure that this person that carrying the pager is by himself.
No, you don't have to, right? So this gets to a very morally ambiguous point, but it is, again, one of the unsavory aspects of war, but it's something that international law basically tolerates, is that the nature of the attack has to be against a lawful target, right? So hypothetically, a Hezbollah militant, right? A member of Hezbollah's military wing. And you have to use only so much force against them that you are not acting disproportionately to the what we would call sometimes collateral damage around it, right? It's a question of proportionality. So if they use an explosive that is dangerous within 3 feet of that person, is that 3-foot range essentially a tolerable range of sort of collateral damage or proportional range, right? Are you being discriminating enough, in other words, in using that explosive? By and large, and I know a lot of people are going to like this answer, probably yes, right? Because if you think about the kinds of munitions that often get used, such as the one that just today was used in an apparent assassination attempt and potentially assassination. I don't think we know, or at least I don't know as of the time we're recording, against the leader of Hezbollah, Nasrallah.
Yeah.
Just today, the Israelis conducted a missile strike against a building in which Nasrallah is believed to have been, or at least as of the strike. And that's incredibly destructive, right? All sorts of people, I am sure, were hurt, if not killed, in that missile strike. And would that be lawful under principles of international law? It might well be, as long as Israel is essentially taking reasonable account. What does that mean? Who knows, to be perfectly honest with you? But it's a matter of good faith. It's a matter of just sort of conscientiousness, right? Are they at least taking those lives into account and taking all feasible measures to prevent the inadvertent loss of life or injuries to people who are not combatant? That's really the standard, is are they taking enough steps to make sure innocent people are not hurt?
I think these are kind of the interviews and discussions that if you're listening, your blood can boil in a certain way, either depends on which side. So I want to make sure for the listeners that they know, like, we asking all the questions because we want to know. Because like in my opinion, for example, if I asked if somebody have a pager and he have his kids and wife next to him, is that a target against civilian? But for somebody who is engaged in that and to have his kids around him, that's on him as well. Like I would argue that's a war crime against him, to have your kid and wife or husband and kids around you, knowing that you are a target. But we are trying to understand, again, the law, because there's so much misinformation, so many people that don't want to say the truth. I mean, obviously I think the international law needs an upgrade. I think there's need to be a lot of, like, even when we talk about genocide or not, like all the things, I think it's like, I think it was very general, and I think it was specific against certain people, mostly in the Middle East, dictators, But like I said before, a lot of times there's also dictators and evil people that wear suit and tie, and we have to make sure that the international law actually covers it. So.
Yeah.
So
getting to the first question you had, I do think it's important, is like, how do we know whether or not Israel was complying with the law of war? Like, were they
they have to
exactly, like, and the honest answer is, like, largely political, because certainly when they do something like this, I can imagine, I don't know, because I'm not privy to it, but I can imagine that their counterparts in their key allies, like the United States, United Kingdom, France, Germany, are going to ask them, like, what did you do here? Show us your homework. And Israel is going to have to justify it, at least to its allies, in the first instance, to say, look, this is how we knew those people being targeted were in fact Hezbollah militants. These are the precautions we took to make sure that the beepers, were in their hands at the time that they were detonated. These are the precautions we took to make sure that surrounding civilians were as protected or as unlikely to be injured as possible.
Well, the United States declared that they had no information; they were not shared and nothing as of now. The official,
and that might be right. Again, these are probably principally, at least in the first instance, conversations that are going to happen between foreign ministries, closed doors, potentially between intelligence agencies and militaries. But at least publicly, they haven't come forward with that kind of information. Then there are circumstances that Israel itself, is a complicated democracy, to say the least, but is a democracy. They have a lot of internal oversight mechanisms, including a very wide open judiciary that allows for sort of inquiry, like quasi-independent, I think is what we can call them, inquiries into the Israeli government's conduct on all sorts of things. And so I think over time, it wouldn't be unusual for something like this to be much more thoroughly examined through either commissions or even through the Israeli court system. That we've seen that a number of, I say that because we've seen that repeatedly with a lot of
but I mean, as of now, I mean, I remember in an interview with you, you said that Israel is one of the armies that have lawyers within the stuff. But do you still believe that this is true after what you've seen the last 300 days? We have not yet to see anybody held accountable for anything.
Hmm.
major, if at all. And there's a lot of questionable operation at best. Therefore, you don't say like there's obviously some operation that was just a disaster. And obviously, if there
Yeah.
was any decent lawyer there, they would say no. But do you still believe the same thing? Do you still believe that
No.
during the 300 days past is that's true? Or war is war?
So okay, so the honest answer is I don't know. I'm not in the IDF. I think Israel has very long established, whether or not you say they're well established, but long established um, internal bureaucratic procedures that would make it. I would be stunned if they completely abandoned the extent of legal participation that they have in their military operations by military lawyers within the IDF, what we would call JAGs in the United States, but military lawyers who operate within the IDF on an operational basis. It's not true that Israel has been completely unwilling to hold individuals accountable. It's been incredibly contentious and fraught, and I don't think by any means perfect within the Israeli government at all. But they have opened up criminal investigations, particularly against IDF soldiers who've been accused of prisoner abuse, which
But I
remain
don't think
ongoing.
anybody has been indicted so far.
I
There's
don't think that's
major
right.
crimes either against, United Nation, even like workers, like somebody, like there's a lot of the main argues, like they say, oh, well, this was Hamas or this was not civilian or this is a mistake or whatever. There is some people that were just, in court for, the sexual abuse of some of the and rape,
Right.
some, but
Yeah, yeah.
nobody was indicted. I haven't seen anybody. Maybe you have in the
I
last,
think it's an ongoing criminal investigation. I haven't followed it
yeah,
extremely closely, but I don't say that to say that Israel has been smelling like a rose at all. I don't misunderstand me. Quite the opposite. I just try to be again pedantic,
yeah,
anal retentive, and fair. And Israel has at least again in the prisoner abuse context, which is the one on which I'm aware, has opened like criminal investigations against their own people for misconduct. It's not all I mean to say by that. It's not 100% fair to say Israel's just completely abandoned the law because I just don't
yeah,
think, as a practical matter, I don't think that's true, and I also don't think it's entirely fair either.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
the but look, when it comes to their conduct, particularly their use of air operations in Gaza, it's pretty stunning. The amount of destruction that they have been willing to undertake. I don't know this for a fact, but it definitely seems as if they have recalibrated, to say the least, their historical approach to proportionality in particular. They used to have by no means perfect, but comparatively, certainly to the United States or other NATO countries, a fairly conservative approach to collateral damage. The United States has historically been much more liberal in treating individuals as lawful targets or as in harm's way, lawfully in harm's way than the Israelis have. I don't know that that remains true, to be perfectly frank. And what you see in Gaza certainly does not suggest that it is. Um, I think the conduct of Israel's campaign in Gaza also has been complicated, and this is partially a legal question, but partially a policy question as well. By the lack of any clear military strategic objective that Israel has been able to articulate, like they say, we want to destroy Hamas. I don't know what that means, right? Like
Yeah.
that's not a and even if that was true, if that was really true, they'd be bombing Qatar, and they're not doing that, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And
I argued
so
that so many times in this show and in others way before even this happened. Yeah.
right, so I mean, their strategic objectives, other than essentially a punitive campaign against infrastructure in Gaza, it's hard to discern. And I'm not. I think it's very hard to discern precisely what what their military objectives are, which in turn makes it difficult to assess some of the legality of what they're doing. Because if they have, clear military objectives in mind that are clearly justifiable and focused, then you can make a legal analysis under concepts like proportionality that at least are arguable and make sense. But so long as their military objectives remain incredibly abstract in their articulation, it becomes very difficult to say, oh, bombing this city block was, proportionate to the military objectives that you've articulated, when they haven't really even articulated clear military objectives that allow you to make those kinds of judgments.
Yeah.
That is also not to say that this is not sort of strategic on Hamas's part as well. Hamas is very much committed. That October 7th was motivated by trying to provoke as violent and overreaction on Israel's part as possible. And I'm confident in that, because that was Al-Qaeda's motive with September 11th, right? These are not difficult strategic judgments to understand. And in a way, Hamas is getting exactly what they wanted from October 7th by provoking Israel to react the way it did in Gaza and to conduct hostilities in the manner it has. And Hamas has done everything to escalate the humanitarian and moral costs of that on Israel. Everything from deeply embedding all of their military equipment into transparently protected targets, whether or not those are hospitals or civilian homes, deeply embedding themselves within the civilian population, using the civilian population as hostages, like Palestinians, as hostages in many situations, preventing Palestinians from leaving areas that are imminently under strike, right? Hamas is waging this as the dirtiest possible war they can, and banking on the fact that enough Israelis in the Israeli government kind of just don't give a fuck anymore, that this is going to be a brutal and grinding conflict in which the costs to the people of Gaza are as high as possible. And it's a perverse tragedy that essentially two extreme elements are pitted against one another in a very small place with a lot of innocent people in the middle.
Yeah. And to be fair, I always, said about Hamas, what they did and what they do to the civilians and what they do to the Palestinian civilians and their response on that's exactly what they wanted. But also to get the real picture. I think anytime, and especially in the Middle East, you cannot start with a certain date. You cannot start as like, oh, on this day this happened. You have to go back and you will see that responsibility. Everyone between the Israeli government, in my opinion, that allowed Hamas to exist, agreed to give them money, agreed to let Qatar doing money, knowing that they are buying weapons and hide it within the Palestinian civilian, because that served also the Israeli agenda of like, look what kind of people, but they wanted to have Hamas versus West Bank. So politics is dirty. I think this mess is shared on a lot of people, including our United States foreign policy, to allow Hamas to exist. Same thing with, that happened with Al-Qaeda. Same thing that happened with Osama bin Laden. Before Osama bin Laden attacked here, he attacked in the Middle East. And when they tried to take him out, they said, no, leave him. He's a freedom fighter. It's like, no, he's not. He's a terrorist. And we were lectured. No. Same thing happened with Hamas, attacked Egypt, attacked their own people. But they let them go. So yes, Hamas played and they're counting on a very dirty war. But they were created also, not necessarily created, but they were supported and existed and funded by Israeli policies as well. So that's the big picture, I believe. I think everybody and unfortunately, the civilians are the ones who pay the price.
Yeah, I think one of the, without sort of getting into too much detail there, I think one of the real deep problems in the conflict, certainly since October 7th, but I think before that, is you have an interest in extremism on both sides, because you have elements that make the judgment that for their own primarily domestic political gains, that having a more extreme enemy on the other side is better than having an enemy or an adversary that is willing to negotiate, willing to de-escalate. I think that has historically been one of the motivations for the Netanyahu government's support of Hamas historically, particularly against Fatah. Fatah is not the most well-run, coherent, liberal governmental organization in the world either, but they are far less extreme than Hamas.
But also having Hamas there is going to guarantee not any Palestinian civilian good person want to run, because he knows he's going to get killed by both.
Right, exactly. It's the old tactic of divide your enemies, divide and conquer. And I get the narrow strategic judgment about that, but I think
Yeah,
it certainly encouraged um, elements within the Israeli government to seek out the most extreme, like literally seek out to remove moderates
yeah,
from their Palestinian sort of counterparts, whether or not it was in Hamas or Fatah, that there was an effort to try and elevate the most extreme elements on the other side because they determined for their own narrow, typically domestic political reasons that that was better than having someone on the other side who was reasonable and willing to negotiate and
yeah,
de-escalate. I think Hamas made the same exact judgment about Israel. I think that
absolutely.
strategically that explains October 7th better than anything
Yeah.
is that by radicalizing the Israelis that they would prevent a situation in which moderate Israeli elements were able
I
to
think it reminds me a lot of back in the
settle.
Gulf War, the first Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein will throw rockets at Israel just to have Israel respond with anything so he can get everybody
Yeah,
involved. It's like, look, I'm fighting
exactly.
Israel, so it's kind of, but to your point, when you say they should have bombed Qatar, it's so interesting. Like when they killed Haniyeh and they have the funeral in Qatar, all the leaders of Hamas were there. What are you doing? They're all there.
Right. So if you're right, if
We're
you're
all
interested in taking
paying
out Hamas,
respect.
yeah.
Like what, So we'll get back to the war because I want to get your thoughts on, now over almost a year coming up to October 7th and all, the tragedies that happened. Um, and I wanted to ask you, do you think that, and would you like, if you are in charge, do you think that anybody will be held accountable uh, for from both sides, I'm talking, not just one side. Do you think somebody would be held accountable? And would should they? According
Um,
again, not
so
we're not talking
taking the
American,
second part.
international law. Yeah.
Again, taking the second part first. Yeah, of course people should, right? I think there
Who?
is
Can you be more
uh,
specific?
Sure. So on the on the Israeli side, I think to the extent they can prove indiscriminate attacks, to the extent they can prove prisoner abuse, to the extent they can prove attacks upon civilian objects. Whether or not, again, I don't want to prejudge this particular beeper attack, but assume, I mean, there's evidence that Israel was acting indiscriminately with the beeper attack, just as hypothetical. I'm not saying they were. I'm just saying, yeah, those would be war crimes, and the Israeli officials responsible should be held guilty, right? They should be prosecuted for those things. And by the
Should it
same
be
token,
Netanyahu?
Hamas waged a genocidal, pogrom into Israel on October 7th that killed and kidnapped indiscriminately Israeli civilians. And like that's literally what we prosecuted people in Rwanda for, right? It's identical.
It should be Haniyeh and Netanyahu, or no, or you're not going as far as Netanyahu. Uh,
I'm gonna just as a practical matter not name names because I'm not an
okay.
investigator and like being I wouldn't be a responsible
But I
lawyer.
guess my
I wouldn't
question
be
is like,
saying that as a lawyer. I'd
yeah,
be saying
no,
that
I
as a
mean, as a
pundit.
lawyer,
Yeah.
is it the person that runs the government, or is it the person that okayed the operation? Because I know, for example, in the United States, some operation is not okayed. The president doesn't even know about it.
Yeah, yeah,
No.
yeah. So the answer is again, and this is why I'm not going to answer it with any
Yeah,
names. Is it can be both, right?
yeah,
Like it
okay.
can, if like take for example some of these prisoner abuse situations. In Abu Ghraib, I think one of the most absurd aspects of the Abu Ghraib scandal was I don't think anyone above the rank of sergeant was prosecuted, even though far more, many. U.S. Military intelligence and political personnel up the chain of command were both aware of and condoned and turned a blind eye to the kind of prisoner abuse we saw at Abu Ghraib.
Yeah.
Uh, and so similarly in the Israeli context, right, I think there have been some fairly well substantiated allegations of prisoner abuse that are currently, as I said, mentioned before, at least some of which are under criminal investigation in Israel themselves. But how systemic are they?
Yeah.
Knew about them, who helped to try and cover them up, who maybe even encouraged them. I don't know that we frankly know the answers to that. People are going to speculate all over. That's what
Yeah.
happens in war.
And
But the point of the law is to figure out actually who is responsible, and
and
then to hold those people accountable.
yeah, and if you are Israel, how would you and why would you negotiate with somebody like Sinwar, knowing that he is the person that okayed that?
Yeah.
Like how is that, I don't know how is that possible. Like, okay, so we know that some, especially that it's not really elected government. Some people can say, oh, they were elected. They were not elected. They were elected years ago, and
Or elected once. Yeah,
yeah.
that's
So,
yeah.
but to, if you are the Israeli, or if you are, I don't think we would negotiate with Osama bin Laden, and say like, hey, listen, let's negotiate.
Yeah.
It's not gonna happen. So you
So
have to figure out a
I'll
way. Yeah.
say, yeah, I'll say two things on that. One is, thankfully, I'm not an Israeli
Yeah.
politician, or and those aren't the kind of hard decisions I have to make. But on that, you don't negotiate with your friends; you
Yeah.
negotiate with your enemies. The United States negotiated with the Taliban.
You sounded like Trump a little bit.
Well, you agree or
They're
disagree?
weak people. I agree with him. I agree with you. Yeah.
Right, like I mean, if you don't negotiate with your friends, right? Like
Yeah.
you don't negotiate peace with your friends. And so if there is a genuine interest in peace and moving on, people are going to have to swallow bitter pills to do that, because that's the nature of a peace process, any real peace process.
Yeah.
Um, that said, though, history is very long. And just because there is a period, even a matter of years, in which a negotiated peace, or there is impunity for war crimes, crimes against humanity, doesn't mean those cases will never be brought. Charles Taylor was sitting pretty as the head of the state of Liberia before he was ousted, essentially in a coup, and was given safe haven in exchange for leaving the country, only to have that safe haven taken away from him so that he was prosecuted in Sierra Leone for war crimes there. Slobodan Milosevic, he signed the Dayton Accords and was ultimately prosecuted in The Hague for his complicity in the Yugoslav armed conflict. Augusto Pinochet, right, lived much of his life as a former head of state, got to live in London until all of a sudden he didn't, and was sent back to Chile to face criminal prosecution for things that he had done 20 years earlier. So that's the beauty and cost of war crimes, is that just because there's a political settlement that's necessary in the short term for the peace, impunity doesn't always last forever. Sometimes it does,
Yeah.
but very often, time is the judge of these things. And so even if there aren't ICC prosecutions or prosecutions of, people who perpetrated October 7th or otherwise, in the next, 2 years, doesn't mean that those people won't find themselves prosecuted somewhere in the next 10.
I think they definitely would. I mean, like, and they should, obviously, everybody responsible for the October 7th and all the crimes before and after that.
Yeah,
Um,
for sure. I just meant,
yeah,
I just mean,
no,
like, again,
no,
it's
I
not.
agree. No, I
Yeah,
agree. I agree with you. And I think people cannot, if you wanna, even the way the crimes were committed, it's like it's a next level. It was
yeah.
awful. Obviously. But now we hear a lot of things like since this war started and before that, it's always genocide, war crimes, you see all these terms that people throw around and they want to compete. While things are simpler than that. There are people are dying and there's hostages that, they were not negotiated for or taken out. They suffer, they still do. you know there's so many children that died, and men and women too. And it's just like there's so many things, and people are so into like, is it genocide, is it not genocide, is it this, is it that? But I think they were, the word, the definition of everything in international law, including genocide, have to change. Because people goes like, oh, the definition is this, but what do you think that you still, because I know we talked before, and you did say that you think that Gaza is an open air prison. You did not think you said that Hamas's attack was genocidal, but you did not think that Israeli attack was genocidal. Do you think the same thing now after all this time, or
Yeah, I do. I mean, I haven't seen, I mean, again, and so I'll just say it this way. And this is me answering as a lawyer.
yeah?
And I understand that in turn makes me sound much more cold-blooded than most people, when you're talking about the law governing war.
But that's
Uh,
again what I'm telling to our listeners
yeah,
is like, this is not opinions. It's not about opinions. It's not about feelings. We all hurt. We all going through stuff. We want to know, because if you don't understand what the law is, you cannot change it. You know, that's
Right.
why we have
And
experts
so
like you, you know. So
thank you, thank you. No, but so I think, look, the bottom line is that I think genocide has gotten thrown around a lot. It's increasingly getting thrown around. I think even Nasrallah accused Israel of genocide for exploding their beepers. That may be illegal for any number of reasons that we talked about. I think the jury is out on that. It's not genocidal, right? There's no genocide against Hezbollah, and that's just not what the word genocide means. Genocide, to put it as simply as possible, is a hate crime. It's the effort to exterminate a particular people in whole or in part because of who they are, as opposed to any other political reason that might exist. Which is why I don't, and look, I think they don't say it in these terms, but Hamas's attack on October 7th is genocidal. That meets every legal definition of genocidal. And they're transparent about that. It was an attack against Israelis as Jews or as Israelis. It was
and the
not
way it was committed.
discriminating. And the way it was committed, again, I've studied the kind of terrible things for many, many years. And the closest analogy we have to October 7th, albeit on a far greater scale over a larger period of time, but is the Rwanda genocide. The politics are extremely similar as well. I'm not going to spend the next 45 minutes talking about the Rwanda genocide. But to anyone who's actually studied it closely, as opposed to just thinking about it as like, oh my God, these crazy Africans are killing each other, which is, I think, unfortunately, how it's often understood even by liberal-minded people. But when you understand what was actually going on in Rwanda, the dynamics and what happened are very, very similar to what happened on October 7th. By the same token, as indiscriminate as much of the IDF's campaign very well may be in Gaza, although, again, I don't know that we know enough about it other than the horrific scale of it to make very specific, particular attack-by-attack judgments about individual attacks and the legality of those attacks, which is what you unfortunately do have to do as a lawyer if you're taking these things seriously as law, as opposed to just the rhetoric of genocide and war crimes. The Israeli campaign against the Palestinians is not consistent with genocide. It's not consistent with the definition of genocide. It's just not. There are a lot of things. There are a lot of reasons to criticize it, and I'm happy to do those, and I do them. But when you actually
and this
look
is one of the things that I say, like, if some people want to do, like, okay, genocide, like if people think it's genocide or not, but you can argue about that there's killing, there's children, there's stuff like that. So stick to the facts instead of trying to label it with one thing. I do think it's genocide, but obviously you have expert in a way. I feel like it's motivated, but by who they are. My argument is, if Hamas was surrounded by American citizens, this will never happen. But because they are Palestinians, then it's happening. That's my argument,
Sure, but again, the distinction between indiscriminate attacks, which, to be clear, are terrible war crimes, right? Like firebombing, what we now sort of call like the firebombings of the Second World War, are probably not legal anymore. You can't. Russia is doing in Ukraine or in Syria, right? Is Russia committing genocide in Syria against anti-Assad Syrians? I just don't think that's accurate. It's not. Are they violent, indiscriminate attacks? Are they sponsoring a regime that uses chemical weapons? Are they? Yes, and those are all war crimes, right? That's all murder. It just doesn't happen to be the particular international crime of genocide, right? And I know people, people get wrapped around this axle pretty tightly. I think because genocide is probably one of the last. It's one of the last terms that carries real moral force. Seems compelling. War crime, like in a way, because of the past 20 years, we've gotten immune to war crimes as being serious.
Sadly,
It's just, so in the 90s, they were very serious, right? Just being war criminal was sufficient to be an enemy of all mankind. And we've been on this kind of sadistic treadmill where we keep escalating the degree of violence and our tolerance for violence and our expectation of it, which is why I think people are now just grasping to call everything genocide, because it's like the worst thing you can say, and we're running out of the worst things you can say. But just as a legal matter, and again, I'm not going to go, chapter and verse through everything
Yeah.
that Israel is doing in Gaza, but it's just not genocide. It's many terrible things potentially, but it's just not genocide. Even
Not the definition of genocide. That's why
it's not
I always,
genocide as a
yeah,
matter of international
of
law. That's
international law.
right.
That's why I think one of the important things is to change the definition of the genocide in international law. Because, like I said, I feel the one thing for me that I feel like if there is a building that full of half terrorists and full of certain people, if you're not gonna do the same action, because if there's different kind of people there,
Yeah,
then you're targeting this. So if there is, when there's Hamas in hospitals, if the babies there are Americans, we're not gonna attack. We know that. Or Israeli, but because the
yeah,
Palestinian will say like, hey, they did that. But
yeah.
so I think we need to have you rewrite the international law.
I'll do my
I'll
best.
vote for you. So from one hot topic
Yeah,
to
yeah,
the other quickly before your time, because again,
right.
you're one of the people like say like I can say anything and people can and you can in one way you explain you manage to take your feelings away, you explain what the law is so people know. So now if you do think it's genocide or if you don't think it's genocide, the problem is the definition as well. It's not just, but if you're going to say like, hey, the definition of this is that, then is it or is it not? So we need to change that because what's happening is, in my opinion, is very bad, genocidal, in my opinion. But maybe that's not the definition as we learn right now. So another thing that I was very upset about is like, and it's crazy how like news like this doesn't even last. When they had the plea guilty with the 9/11 attackers and
Yeah.
first of all, why they still not in jail and why is not they not dead?
Well,
Why?
they're in jail. They've been in jail for a while.
Yeah, in jail but
But
not
yeah,
dead. Why they not executed? And the
yeah,
second thing is like why? So this deal was blocked, you know, which I was very happy that this happened because it was I think this deal is insulting, to anybody that lived through 9/11, the victims obviously of 9/11, to everybody. Like it was just so that you don't I cannot believe that they. So can you explain to us why did they feel you were a lawyer in
yeah.
Guantanamo Bay a lot, so why would they need to do a bleak deal and why they still not executed?
Sure. So, I am also someone who lived through 9/11. I was in New York then, and I think the deal was the least worst option, in what is a now decades long tragedy of not only the United States' own making, but at least in part. And that's why I think a deal has become necessary. Why a deal? Um, Primarily because in the immediate aftermath of September 11th, the Bush administration thought it would be a good idea to torture people in secret dungeons all around the world. And as a consequence of that, they took what should have been a very clear-cut determination of guilt, that very well we could have executed potentially these people for had we brought them once we captured them, brought them to New York and put them on trial. I don't think we'd even still be talking about them anymore. Timothy McVeigh was tried, convicted, and executed all within about 5 or 6 years.
Yeah.
Uh, all by the end of the Clinton administration. But instead, the Bush administration, for maybe some good reasons, like I'll give them the benefit of the doubt, but plenty of bad reasons that had nothing to do with American national security and had more to do with a certain pose, a certain posture of wanting to get tough on the war on terrorism and wanting to kind of prove that the United States was capable of operating outside the law, decided that we're not going to comply with the Geneva Conventions. We're going to create these legal monstrosities like Guantanamo, which have become tar pits, of a tar pit of problems, and that we're going to engage in torture all around the world, and then we're going to try not just to prosecute these men who we tortured, we're going to try and prosecute them based on the evidence that we got torturing them. And on top of all of that, we're going to try and do it in an entirely novel criminal justice system that we're going to make up from scratch, that we're going to conduct on a remote military base in Cuba that is going to be operated by military personnel who don't have deep experience doing complex international organized crime cases, to say the least. And we're going to try and jerry rig the rules to make sure that we guarantee ourselves convictions without realizing that every time you change one rule in a complex interlocking criminal justice system, you end up sort of pulling threads that are going to have surprising effects down the line. Oh, and on top of all that, we're going to try and do it in almost near total secrecy at the top secret level. And so you take all of those early decisions that happened really between, I would say, 2002 up through about 2006, and you've created a perfect storm of dysfunction in Guantanamo, such that here we are in 2024, and there's no trial date set, right? They are still in pretrial proceedings in the September 11th case, which started in 2008. So here we are, right, 16 years later, and there is not, even the inkling of an actual trial on the merits against these men in, I would say, by the end of the decade. I think that is actually almost ridiculous to say it's by the end of the decade at this point. There's no chance of it. And there are a whole lot of reasons for it, most of which relate to the combination of the fact that we tortured them, the fact that we're operating it in this totally jerry-rigged military justice system that doesn't function at all, let alone function efficiently or properly, and that we're trying to keep as much of what we're doing there secret as possible, which just makes everything take absolutely, 5 times as long as it would otherwise. And so I think if as someone who lived through September 11th attacks, who had very was deeply and personally affected by that, who wanted justice for that, who thinks nothing would have been greater for the United States or for history than to have brought the 9/11 defendants, not even the U.S. federal court, New York State court, right? Like have them send them to Rikers, have them sit on a wooden bench, handcuffed together, get called up to for their arraignment, and then put them on trial where the only focus of that trial would be the 3,000 people who died for hardly any reason that can be explained clearly on a Tuesday morning, and make them the centerpiece, right? Make the victims the centerpiece of this trial. And I think that would have been an amazing moment. I don't think we would have had 9/11 truthers. Yeah. I don't think we would have, any number of things that have metastasized in our culture, in our law, in our politics since September 11th wouldn't have happened had we just stuck to our guns and did what, frankly, we do best as Americans, which is go to court and deal with it there.
And they should have been executed at the site too.
And they would have been executed a long time ago. I can promise you that. And we didn't do that, and so that's where we're at. And so I think just to finish the thought, I think a plea deal is frankly the only way that anyone who was a victim of the September 11th attack will actually have any meaningful closure, because a big part of that deal that got thrown out, I think, for political reasons, and may not have even been thrown out. There's litigation about that now because it's not even obvious that the Secretary of Defense had the ability to overturn the deal after it was signed. But even if it goes forward, I think it's the only way that victims of the September 11th attacks are going to have any day in court. And I think it's going to be a meaningful opportunity too, because one of the pieces of that deal, which did not get reported on, which I thought was very powerful, was the defendants, particularly Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of the September 11th attacks, agreed to sit on the stand and take questions from the victims directly. Wow. And that is, other than like South Africa, right, with the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, I have never heard of something like that happening in a meaningful way in a courtroom, where a victim really just gets to confront the person who, in many cases, destroyed their life. Yeah. And so I think that part of the deal, which I don't think has gotten enough attention, would have been reason enough. I can't speak for every victim, so I'm not going to, but I think it was a profound opportunity that I hope is not missed, because I think certainly the victims, but I think the country just needs closure around this case. And it's never going to happen in a contested trial in Guantanamo. It's just never going to happen. They're never going to be executed in Guantanamo under any circumstances. And so we may as well take what we can get now, as imperfect as it is.
Yeah, I do think that slow justice is not justice,
Yeah, justice delayed is justice denied. And I think we've now long crossed the point
Yeah.
of justice denied.
And it's you know that those like who lived around that time like you and me, and it's like New York is never the same. You know,
No, it wasn't.
it's different vibe, different everything. Like, and people don't get it except if you were here, you know. So
Sure.
uh well, that was awesome. It's always great to talk to you. And again, you know, I invite people, as hard as this discussion is to always try to take yourself out. And I think when you understand the truth about definition of things, you can be able to change things. So if you don't like the definition, like I said, of genocide, then we change it. War crimes, then we change it. You know, stuff like that to hopefully become better human beings. And I think, and I always believe that the justice will be served eventually, you know, and those who committed any kind of crime will be held accountable one day. And thank you so much for being here. Do you have any upcoming books or projects or anything coming up? You
No,
plan?
no.
I know you
Last,
plan. I know you're up to something. You're just not getting.
yeah. We finished the Light of Battle. I'm still talking to folks about that. Hopefully, people think it's a good read. People seem to like it. But it's all about it's a biography of Dwight Eisenhower and the lead up to D-Day, focusing on the lead up to D-Day. And it just hopefully provides, you know, a lot of the stuff we talked about today ends up echoing in this book in various ways because, you know, we think about history in very neat and tidy terms, but the people living through it certainly didn't know how it was going to turn out. And I tried to convey that as much as possible in the book. And so hopefully people will find it both interesting and a good read, but even inspiring because, you know, all these big figures in our you know, in our history books who are on money and statues turned out were actually just, you know, red-blooded people who, you know, drank too much, didn't sleep enough, and were just doing the best they could, just like we are. So
Yeah, I will have. It's a great book. It really is, and I will have the link in the description of this episode as well, so you can just go click on it and you'll find it. Michel Paradis, thank you so much for being here, and we had time to talk, even though Noam was not here. So we actually talked. We had an opportunity, but we miss you, Noam. We want to get the second half because I'm sure he's gonna try to get you all to himself next time he comes.
happy to do it. All right, see you guys.
Thank you very much.